Good morning. It is truly a pleasure to be with you here today. I bring greetings from Gettysburg College, a college founded in 1832, a mere 31 years before the Battle of Gettysburg. We were known as Pennsylvania College back then, and were located at the north end of town about 1.5 miles from here. That was a pivotal location during the first day of the battle when Union troops fled through our campus, pursued by Confederate soldiers. Our most iconic building on campus, Pennsylvania Hall, then known as Old Dorm, is a large white stately building with a red roof and cupola, and it served as a hospital during and after the battle, like most large buildings in town. As some of you may know, we at Gettysburg College feel a very deep connection with this cemetery and with the Gettysburg Address. As you heard from Superintendent Kirby, after the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin asked a local prominent attorney, David Wills, to procure the land for a cemetery to bury those who'd fallen during the battle. David Wills was an alumnus of Gettysburg College, a member of the class of 1851. We're gathered here today on the land that Wills purchased for that purpose. In addition to procuring this land, David Wills personally invited President Abraham Lincoln to attend the cemetery dedication to say a few appropriate remarks. David Wills and his wife also hosted President Lincoln in their home the evening before the dedication. The following morning, our students and faculty walked up to the center of town and joined the townspeople outside of David Wills's house as they followed President Lincoln out here to the cemetery. Each year, when we welcome our first-year students into our community, we recreate that walk from campus through the center of town, down Baltimore Street to this cemetery, to hear and reflect on the Gettysburg Address. It's a venerable tradition which many of our alumni recall as a defining moment, one that reinforces for our students the significance of this historic context in which they will be studying for the next 4 years. We are very proud of the relationship of the college to this cemetery and to Lincoln's address. Gettysburg College is also proud of its association with one of our speakers today, historian and biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin. I'm sure that many of you have read her book, Team of Rivals, which won the 2005 Lincoln Prize awarded annually by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and Gettysburg College. Of course, Team of Rivals is the setting for Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln. Dr. Goodwin has also graciously agreed to be on Gettysburg College's honorary committee for the sesquicentennial commemoration of the American Civil War. Doris Kearns Goodwin credits baseball as jump-starting her history career. As a young Brooklyn Dodgers fan, she would painstakingly keep score of the afternoon Dodgers games on the radio and would recreate each inning for her father when he returned home from work each day, not knowing that he already knew the outcome by the time he arrived home. This wonderful tale of growing up in the 1950s is warmly captured in her memoir, Wait Till Next Year. Having earned her undergraduate degree with high honors from Colby College, Dr. Goodwin received a PhD in government from Harvard. Early in her career, she served as a White House Fellow in the Johnson administration. She later taught government at Harvard for 10 years, and during this time assisted former President Johnson with his memoirs. Doris Kearns Goodwin is the author of biographies of several U.S. presidents, including Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream, the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, An American Saga, and No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the home front in World War II, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1995. Not surprisingly, Dr. Goodwin is often sought after by the media for commentary on the presidency, and of course she has been especially sought after in this election year. It gives me great pleasure this morning to welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Thank you. History at its best, I believe, is about telling stories. Stories about people who lived before, about events in the past that create the contours of the present. By studying the lives of others, we hope that we, the living, can learn from their struggles and triumphs. and no president understood better the power of stories than Abraham Lincoln. Indeed, in the Gettysburg Address we commemorate today, Lincoln translated the story of our country into words of enduring clarity and beauty, a country founded on the majestic idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, an idea that would serve as a beacon of hope to the world at large. Lincoln's passion for telling stories had taken root when he was only 6 years old, when he would sit transfixed in the corner listening to his father and his friends swap tales. He would then spend half the night walking up and down trying to reformulate the conversations that he had heard into language any boy could understand. The following day, having translated those stories into words and ideas that his young friends could grasp, he would climb onto a tree stump that served as an impromptu stage and memorize and mesmerize his own circle of listeners. He had discovered the pride and pleasure that an attentive audience could bring. This great storytelling talent and oratorical skill would eventually constitute his stock in trade through both his legal and political careers. How fitting it is, then, that we celebrate this day with Steven Spielberg, the most honored and magical storyteller of our time. Even as a child, Lincoln dreamed heroic dreams. From the outset, he was aware of a destiny far beyond that of his unlettered father and his hard-scrabbled childhood. While his formal schooling did not amount to more than 1 full year, books became his academy, his college. "There is no frigate like a book," wrote Emily Dickinson, "to take us lands away." How true this was for Lincoln. Though he never would leave America, never would travel to Europe, he went with Shakespeare's kings to merry England, with Lord Byron's poetry to Spain and Portugal. Literature allowed him to transcend his surroundings. He seemed especially drawn to poetry that spoke of our doomed mortality and the transience of earthly achievements, perhaps because he had suffered so many losses in his early life. "I am going away from you now, Abraham," his mother said, as she lay dying when he was 9 years old, "and I shall never return." His only sister Sarah died a few years later, and his first love, Anne Rutledge, at the age of 22. As he brooded over the deaths of these 3 women that he had loved, he acknowledged that it was a terrible thing to think that when we die, that is the last of us, that our life on earth is simply swept away, dust to dust. As he grew older, he found consolation, however, in the thought that when we die, our image lives on in the memory of others. He derived increasing comfort from the thought that if he could accomplish something worthy, something that would stand the test of time, his honor, his reputation would outlive his earthly existence. So that admirable ambition became his lodestar. It carried him through a significant depression when he was in his early 30s, when sorrows came, in Shakespeare's words, in battalions. His engagement to Mary Todd had been broken. Joshua Speed, the only friend to whom he'd opened his heart about these huge ambitions, was leaving Springfield, and his political career in the state legislature was on a downward slide. "I am now the most miserable man living," he told a friend. "To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better." Worried that he was suicidal, his friends removed all razors and knives from his room. Joshua Speed warned Lincoln in a conversation both men would remember as long as they lived, that if he did not rally, he would most certainly die. Lincoln said he was more than willing to die, but had done nothing to make any human being remember that he had lived, and that to leave the world a little better place for his having lived in it was what he desired to live for. So fueled by that ambition, he gradually recovered from his depression, returned to the state legislature, eventually won a seat in Congress, and then, after losing twice for the Senate, surprised the nation with an upset victory for the presidency. And the rest, as they say, is history. In 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, Lincoln invited his old friend Joshua Speed to the White House. He reminded him of that conversation of 2 decades earlier. And then, speaking of the proclamation, he declared, "I believe that in this measure my fondest hopes will be realized." As he was about to put his signature on the historic proclamation, however, he found that his arm was numb from shaking hands at a New Year's reception that morning. "If my hand trembles when I sign this," he said, "all who examine the document later will say he hesitated. Yet never in my life did I feel more certain that I was doing right. If my name ever goes into history, it'll be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." So he waited and waited until he could sign with a bold and clear hand. But Lincoln in his wildest dreams could never have imagined, neither at that moment nor with the passage of the 13th Amendment, enshrined by Steven Spielberg, Tony Kushner, and Daniel Day-Lewis, how far his reputation and his honor would reach. The great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy provides evidence of the reach of that reputation in an interview with a New York newspaper at the turn of the 20th century. Tolstoy told of a recent trip he had made to a really remote area of the Caucasus where there were a group of wild barbarians. They were so excited to have Tolstoy in their midst, they asked him to tell stories about the great men of history. So he said, I told them about Napoleon and Frederick the Great and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. But before I finished, the chief of the barbarians stood up and said, but wait, you haven't told us about the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that is so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he would be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln. After telling them everything he knew about Lincoln's life, Tolstoy pondered why it was that Lincoln overshadowed all the others. Not as great a general as Napoleon, not as skillful a statesman, perhaps, as Frederick the Great. But Tolstoy concluded, and generations of historians would agree, his greatness consisted in the moral fiber of his character and the integrity of his person. So in the end, Abraham Lincoln's fierce ambition to have his story told had indeed been realized. That worthy ambition to accomplish something had carried him through his bleak childhood, his laborious efforts to educate himself, his string of political failures, and the darkest days of the war. His story would be told, which is why I shall always be grateful for this curious love of history, allowing me to spend a lifetime looking back into the past, allowing me to believe that the private people we have loved and lost in our families, and the public figures we have respected in history really can live on, so long as we pledge to tell and to retell the stories of their lives. I am honored to be one of those storytellers today. Thank you very much.